I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming online.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the characters and plot to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back
Relax
and
and
enjoy
enjoy
Stream
Stream On.
On. Today, we'll be reviewing CQ, streaming on Amazon Prime.
Paris, 1969. Paul is an editor on a new wave science fiction film, code name Dragonfly. He obsessively films every aspect of his life, alienating his girlfriend Marlene. When the film loses its director, Paul gets his chance to take over and finish the film while falling for Valentine, the actor playing Dragonfly.
CQ was written and directed by Roman Coppola in his directorial debut. It's inspired by 1960s European science fiction films like Barbarella and really is an homage to those films. CQ stars Jeremy Davies as Paul Ballard, a young editor turned director, Angela Lindvall as Valentine, the lead actress who plays Dragonfly, Elodie Boucher as Marlene, Paul's girlfriend, Jason Schwartzman as Felix DeMarco, a flashy director, Billy Zane as Mr. E, the male lead in the Dragonfly film, Giancarlo Giannini as Enzo, the Italian producer, and a cameo by Sofia Coppola, who plays Enzo's mistress. So, Jeff, you chose CQ. Why did you pick this film?
Because it looked weird. So the trailer grabbed me since I like retro movies. Some of the science fiction films that this pays homage to, such as Barbarella that you mentioned, but also movies like The 10th Victim and The Final Program. I really like new wave science fiction films. This seemed like an interesting premise. I also enjoy movies that are set within a filmmaking framework. Some of my favorite films that use that kind of structure to tell stories about creativity, art, and culture, like Ed Wood, Shadow of the Vampire, and Boogie Nights. So a wide variety of films can fit into that structure. Because movies are one of the central modes of cultural transmission in the United States, and I would argue globally, movies about films and filmmaking can have an interesting metatextual commentary about the idea of films and their impact on our culture. So that's from the initial reason I picked it, good trailer, to the big picture.
So, it wasn't because it was a Coppola that did the film.
I actually didn't even know it was a Coppola movie when I saw the trailer. I didn't realize that until I did some research in the movie.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let's jump right into our plot analysis. So, as a writer, Jeff, what would you like to point out about this particular film?
Well, since I mentioned how much I like movies set within the filmmaking framework, I thought I'd get into that and really get into whether this movie handles that framework well. I don't think it does, which is my first knock against this movie and a pretty big one. Some sequences work well. There is a scene near the end where we see the filming of a chase scene in a tunnel, and it cuts between what the audience would see on the screen and the actual behind the scene kind of setting. So you see the cameras and you see Paul directing and all that kind of stuff. There are other sequences, including an extended fight that's supposed to take place on the moon, which doesn't work because you never see the behind the scene aspect. It is just the movie. And you start to wonder, it's like some of the scenes in there, how are they being filmed in the real world, in the sense of the world that the film exists in? There are also a couple of scenes that apparently are Paul's fantasies, where he is injecting himself into the film, but those are handled very unevenly, and there's no particular cue as to when they're happening or even why they're happening. So it all gets a little confusing. The best way to handle this kind of structure, I think, is exemplified by a Japanese horror movie called One Cut of the Dead. And the first half of that movie appears to be taking place during the filming of a low budget zombie movie when a real zombie apocalypse starts. And then the second half, you actually see all the behind the scenes stuff. And what it really is that there's another layer of unreality in that the film that we just watched in the first like 30 minutes is actually a movie being filmed, and we see how everything was done. And it's a really interesting way of looking at it. This movie, though, like I said, it's so uneven that I had a lot of problems with. So, what did you think? Did that aspect of this movie, the film within a film, did that work for you?
It didn't. I would agree that it was poorly executed. And I think one of the big issues I had with the movie within the movie is that the side plot was more interesting than the main plot. So the side plot was like seen the scenes from Codename Dragonfly, the film, and the main plot was supposed to be about Paul's journey from editor to director and his obsession with Dragonfly or Valentine, the actress, and how that impacted his relationship with Marlene, his girlfriend. And like, we're supposed to care about that more. But I found myself bored with the real life stuff and just waiting for another scene of the Dragonfly movie. And to me, that's a problem. Like, it's just Paul is I think one of the issues is I didn't find Paul to be a particularly interesting character. Like, he's this guy trying to make an artsy, boring film about his life, capturing what's raw and real. Like, you see a clip where it's like it opens with this black and white, like the entire film opens with a black and white, um, like artsy video of Paul's life, and it's random scenes from his life, like soap and water going down a drain and coffee and a fern, like just boring stuff that I guess he finds artsy. And that is, in a nutshell, what this character is. And he's really obsessed with himself and his filming to the point where he ignores his girlfriend, Marlene. And we endure multiple scenes of Marlene pouting about not having enough attention paid to her because Paul's in love with the camera and Valentine, and it gets repetitive and boring. It would have been better to just open with more Codename Dragonfly like clips, because that's the most interesting part of this movie. And yeah, I thought it was weird when Paul was explaining Codename Dragonfly in the restaurant to Felix, the flashy director that they were gonna hire to do it. And he inserts himself into it. It was uneven. I agree with that, and it didn't quite fit with the rest of the film because it didn't. It just happened sporadically, and there was no rhyme or reason when it happened. So I just found him to be kind of a boring character, and I was just waiting for more Codename Dragonfly because at least that was a bit campy and like satire of movies like Barbarella. But I don't think that the side plot was supposed to be more interesting than the main plot of the story. And that was the biggest issue I had with this movie. I think this movie would have worked better. I'm curious your thoughts, but do you think it would have worked better if they did more of like like an Austin Powers type of movie where the entire film is actually set within the campy sci-fi movie instead of looking at all the stuff going on behind the scenes, like where it's making fun of that genre of film?
No, I don't. Not for the story that was being told. Having that behind the scenes making up a film and trying to capture the what it's like to have an artistic vision was one of the central points of the movie. Doing just a comedic homage or just a I don't know farce based on those movies would just be another type of film. The problem, and something that you repeated a couple of times, is Paul. What is Paul's vision? Paul doesn't bring a particular vision to the film. As far as I can tell, the ending is the same as what we see when we get a glimpse of Gerard Depardieu plays the initial director of what he was going to have it end as. There's no real indication of exactly what it is that Paul wants to capture on film. The bits that we get, as you've pointed out, of his home movies, which one would assume is, you know, his inner voice, are pretty bland. It's the kind of stuff that not even a first year film student is going to film and think is provocative or interesting, let alone an experienced editor. There's another movie that actually shows how this can be done well. Have you ever seen the movie Shadow of the Vampire?
I have not.
Okay. Shadow of the Vampire was released in 2000. It stars John Malkovich and William Dafoe. And it is about the filming of the 1922 horror movie Nosferatu. The conceit in Shadow of the Vampire is that the vampire is real. So Malkovich, who plays Murnau, who was the director of Nosferatu, found this vampire somewhere and somehow and brings him into the film to give it verisimilitude. Murnau is willing to sacrifice his crew and cast to get this kind of reality on film that he wouldn't get from just having an actor with, fake fangs. We get to see a real commentary on the lengths that people will go to realize their vision. But in the case of CQ and Paul in particular, he doesn't seem to have a vision at all. He's pretty bland and more of a cipher than anything else.
This film didn't seem to have a vision to me either. Like, if we think about the film sort of as a mirror of Paul, it didn't feel cohesive. Like, I felt like I was watching two different films. One film, Dragonfly, the movie, and then the other film about Paul's boring life and his relationship troubles. Like, it didn't blend together well for me. And I don't even know if it was a good homage film to early cinema. It's not like like one of my favorite homage films is Hugo, right? Martin Scorsese's film about his love of early cinema, and it takes place in Paris as well. And there's a lot of film geeky moments. Like that was a much better homage film than this one.
I agree with everything you just said, with the exception of the comment about Hugo. Not because I don't think it's a good movie, it's just I haven't seen it. A film that is a better look at like the craft of filmmaking, but for a kind of a marginal or niche sort of part of cinema. The case of this movie, it's the kind of Euro new wave sci-fi. But the film I would look at is Tim Burton's Ed Wood, which, that is low budget, no talent guerrilla filmmaking from the 50s. But it's done in such a brilliant way that you see both the creative drive of Ed Wood, and you also get a sense of what these people who are making these kind of poverty row films, what they went through to get them done. This movie, because it's trying to mash together two storylines that don't really work well together and have a central character who doesn't seem to have a particular vision, doesn't work as much of anything.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the other things that bothered me about this film is, if you're going to pick some theme to focus on, the film put a lot of energy in multiple scenes talking about the importance of having a good ending. There's like a fight at the beginning between the director and producer about what type of ending it should be. One wanted a whimper, the other wanted a bang. And multiple times they repeat the importance of having a good ending. And I felt that for as much emphasis as they put on that, the ending sucked. The ending in Codename Dragonfly sucked, and the ending to the overall movie CQ sucked. Like, I kept waiting for the punchline of what CQ even meant, and I never got it. I'm like, it never once describes what CQ means in this film. So I had to Google it, and apparently it means seek you, and it's about finding love. I mean, did you get that? Like, I didn't get that this movie was particularly about finding love. So there's that. And then, like, the way Codename Dragonfly ended was with this cheesy evil twin trope. So we're returning back to the cliche of that. We just did A Simple Favor last week, and they just ended with Dragonfly having an evil robotic twin. And I get it was supposed to be like campy and satire, but it wasn't really a very exciting ending. So Paul bombed that ending. And then the actual film, CQ, like the movie in its totality, ended in sort of a lackluster way. Like, we see Paul at a film festival showing his artsy film, with those boring scenes we saw at the beginning in black and white with like water going down the drain, and a few people interested, but it didn't seem like it was that impressive. And then he and Valentine were starting to film something new together, that also looked like it was going to be an artsy film. The end. Like, it just was kind of a letdown. Like, I didn't get what the movie was about. Like, now he and Valentine are together now? I don't know. Like, it was sort of meh. I mean, what did you think about those endings? Either the Codename Dragonfly ending or the CQ ending?
I actually didn't care too much about the codename Dragonfly ending, except what I mentioned earlier is that I still am unclear what Paul's vision for all of this was, because it certainly didn't show up in the ending, except I guess the robot twin was his idea, which is unfortunate. There is a scene when he is in Rome visiting one of the producers, one of the financiers for the film. And there's a nice scene set like in this little piazza, I guess, and he's out wandering around at night. And there's a little thing where he runs into a group of young people, and one of them, her boyfriend, I believe, has deserted from the army to meet her. And clearly that's supposed to be the inspirational moment for him, because after that, I believe he says, I have my ending, or something to that effect. But it doesn't really show up in the ending we see for the movie. So I'm not even sure what we're supposed to take away from that sequence in Rome. For the ending of the film, around the film, the story of Paul and his creative journey, the ending being kind of ambiguous would have worked better if that was one of the themes of the film, the ambiguity of the creative process, that in the context of the stuff we do writing, endings are rarely exactly what, even as the writer, you may have envisioned, because you're constrained by the story you wrote, the words you're going to use, the feeling you want to convey at the end, and the fact that at some point stories do just have to end. But this movie is very much about having to have that satisfying ending, where one assumes by satisfying ending, they filmmakers mean things are wrapped up in a way that plays to the themes that have been set up in the movie. And I don't think they were. It just sort of stops. Paul doesn't even get to be a really well-known director. There's a scene where he's doing a little Q&A with a small group of people, and one woman approaches him with her script and asks if he can give it to another director. So even after all this, he's still kind of this low-level person in the industry, which seems kind of a letdown for someone who, in theory, got to finally see his vision on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, there was really no character growth for Paul. He started out dull and obsessed with his own artsy film, and he ended the same way with like he didn't learn anything from what happened with his relationship with Marlene because she eventually leaves him because he's so self-involved and not paying attention to her. He's a pretty shitty boyfriend. But yeah, there just doesn't seem to be any growth, and it's just meh. It's like Roman just ran out of ideas and so decided to end it. I mean, maybe this is a stretch, but maybe you could say there was that argument at the beginning between the director and producer of Dragonfly, and one wanted the bang and one wanted the whimper ending. So maybe you could say, well, the bang ending was codenamed Dragonfly with the elaborate car chase scene and the evil twin robot thing. And the whimper was how CQ ended. I mean, maybe, but neither felt satisfying. And yeah, I think the main issue is they just didn't pick a very interesting character to focus on. Paul was a poorly written character that lacked depth. And you could feel that dullness throughout this movie. So the whole thing you brought up, like how he got the inspiration for the ending of Dragonfly, there's this really weird scene, and it felt completely out of place in this film where Paul meets his dad at the airport. Like you get the sense that the dad is passing through to like layover to another destination. And so Paul goes and meets his dad at the airport, and his dad starts telling him about this strange dream he has about with Paul having a doppelganger. And then he confesses to cheating on Paul's mom. And it's just felt so weird to have this in the movie. And the only thing I can think of why they had this scene is that it was to maybe give Paul a little more depth. I don't know, but to really to shoehorn it in so that he gets his idea for the ending about the idea of having a doppelganger or an evil twin. I mean, what were your thoughts about that particular scene?
I agree with you that was probably the thought behind having it in the movie, in the sense of here's where Paul got the idea for the robot twin. But it was a waste of time. I didn't think it was particularly interesting. It didn't, to me, add anything to Paul, and it seemed really out of nowhere. It didn't go, I don't think it went anywhere either.
Yeah, no, it was very much forced in to explain how Paul came up with his evil twin ending. It was like that and that one scene in Rome that you mentioned. So, yeah, it just this whole movie felt disjointed and piecemealed like that, where it's just random scenes strung together, but they didn't connect and weave in a way that told interesting story. Visually, there was some nice moments to look at, especially when they were in the Codename Dragonfly movie. Like that's probably the best part of this movie was some of the visual stuff when they're in her she has like a headquarters that looks all futuristic and spacey on top of the Eiffel Tower. And that was like visually fun to look at with has a really like a filter on it that made you feel like you were very much in a 1960s sci-fi film. And they had some fights on the moon that were really campy, and that to me was the most interesting part of this film.
I agree completely with the comment about the disjointed nature of this movie. The films that I've mentioned that are good examples of movies like this are not disjointed. They understand how to take stories about filmmaking and the people involved and still tell a coherent, compelling story. This film had some interesting moments, but it never fully committed to what kind of movie it wanted to be. If this had been a film about some struggling filmmaker living off his girlfriend in an apartment in Paris who's obsessively filming his whole life, and then at the end, something happens and either his film's a success, or he realizes he's going to do something else, or whatever the thrust of the movie is going to be, that might have worked. If it's going to be about, this editor who gets the chance to direct the film, and then about all the back end stuff that's happening as he's trying to take what was someone else's vision and turn it into his own, that could have been interesting.
Yeah, I thought that it might be more interesting if the film had shifted their focus and had your primary protagonist be Valentine. Because she starts out as like a nobody. She's just a beautiful woman that the original director picked out of a protest, right? She was an American protesting. I can't remember what she was protesting, but he just saw her in a crowd, picked her out, and then because she was pretty, kind of got her to star in this film. And might have been more interesting to focus on her and where she came from and why was she protesting and what is it like to be this American in Paris trying to navigate being an actress all of a sudden and people, seeing you and noticing you and taking pictures of you and all that. And then you have these various men obsessed with you, between Paul and then the previous director. They put that he was also obsessed with her. And I think that might have been more interesting to have her as our primary point of view character.
There are three characters in this movie who I think would have been a better focus. Valentine is one. The other two are Marlene, because the actress does a good job and she actually has some interesting scenes and some emotional depth. And that could have been fascinating. It's like, what's it like to be that person who is connected to this struggling filmmaker as he's trying to create his vision but has to sell out or whatever to be, in the industry and work on these cheesy campy sci-fi films. The other person would have been the Jason Schwartzman character, who is a director who is initially brought in to replace the first guy who's fired. And he is presented in a way that's a lot more colorful. It's a little douchey, but he has personality and some spark to him, and the character is amusing. And he seems to actually have some vision for what it is that he wants to put on the screen, even if it's might be lowbrow, but it's still a vision. Any of those characters and any of their stories could have been a lot more interesting than those.
Yeah, agreed. So, is there anything else about this film, Jeff, that you wanted to point out?
It's an interesting concept, and it does capture that retro feel, which I appreciate. It has all those ingredients to be a good movie. It just is fairly bland. That's really about it.
Okay, well, let's jump into our wrap up then.
What was your favorite scene?
So, as I mentioned earlier, my favorite parts of this movie, because they were visually interesting, were when we actually were inside the Codename Dragonfly movie. And so my favorite scene is when Dragonfly lands on the moon in her spaceship and she's wearing her like sexy skin tight space outfit and she battles the rebels, which are set up to be these like rebels from the 1960s. They're really campy looking, and Mr. E, played by Billy Zane, is the primary one, and she ends up like breaking into his lair and making love to him, and it's just fun, campy, way over the top, and enjoyable to watch for that reason. What about you, Jeff?
I enjoyed the scene in Rome that I mentioned earlier with Paul walking into the square and seeing those people and getting like a little snippet of what the story is. And the actor at that point does a nice job of just kind of demonstrating just through facial expression that he's had some sort of aha moment. The fact that it doesn't go anyplace, I don't think detracts from that just being a nice little moment in an otherwise fairly blah film. So, what scene did you dislike?
The scenes, there are multiple scenes, and they just get repetitive after a while. It's the scenes with Paul and Marlene where Paul's not paying attention to her. He's focused on filming his fern or whatever. And Marlene's pouting, saying, "Pay attention to me, pay attention to me." And I'm just like, "Marlene, leave him already. He is not interested in you. He clearly is just obsessed with himself and the films and this Valentine." Like, just got boring and repetitive to have this see the same fight over and over again, and it took her quite a while to actually leave him. So those are my least favorite scenes. What about you?
So, I actually did not like the moon fight sequence, and not because of how it looked. It was fun, campy, colorful, all that. The problem is that none of it is from the behind the scenes production point of view. It is presented as an audience in a theater might see it, but we're still in the process within the film of the film being made. So that's a scene that would have benefited from a mix of audience point of view from for Codename Dragonfly and audience point of view for CQ that we get in the tunnel chase sequence. So, Steph, how many pandas out of 5 are you going to give to CQ?
Two pandas. This is a skip for me. I only gave it 2 points because I did enjoy the scenes from Codename Dragonfly itself. And that was, to me, the only enjoyable part of this film. Rest of the film didn't go anywhere interesting. Our protagonist Paul didn't grow up or down in a meaningful way. Boring main plot, dull ending. So yeah, I would skip this one unless you really, really, really like European 1960s sci-fi and you want to see an homage to that. This is one that you're gonna leave feeling, ugh, I just wasted some time watching this. What about you, Jeff?
I'm also going to go with two pandas. I found the setting to be interesting. I like the retro setting. The film itself looks fine, and there are some fine sequences in it. A couple of performances are pretty good, but overall, the lack of a strong central character and a coherent plot just makes this more of a pass than anything else. There are far better movies on a similar theme that you can see.
Okay, well, that wraps up CQ, and we are both in agreement with our 2 out of 5 pandas. We rarely agree exactly on our panda rating, so that's cool. I wanted to point that out. So, Jeff, what do we have coming up next week?
So next week we'll be reviewing High Rise, currently streaming on Tubi. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Wrights Media. Reproduction without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2021.